Edward and Sarah tied the knot when they were both barely out of their teens. They acted not from wisdom, but from a deep and passionate love. At least that's what Sarah liked to believe. For 8 years, they lived in perfect harmony. But then the incessant questioning began from every direction. "When are you having kids?" Edward would laugh it off with a joke, but his wife wasn't amused. Instead, her mood darkened like a storm cloud. The truth was, Edward had developed a growing fondness for the bottle over the past 6 months, driven by constant work stress. In the evenings, he often turned to alcohol, leaving Sarah uneasy. For her, it replaced the intimate conversations they used to share. Edward didn't see an issue. He felt entitled to unwind after a hard day's work. One evening, with just an hour and a half left in her shift, Sarah was checking her email when she suddenly remembered. Today was the last day to pick up her order, or it would be sent back. She groaned, imagining her sister's fury if she didn't get the materials for her crafts on time. Her sister, swamped with work, had asked Sarah to pick it up. Frantically, Sarah called her husband, hoping he could help. But as soon as he answered, his tone set her on edge. "Are you drinking? What's going on?" she asked, feeling her stomach tighten. She could hear music and male voices in the background. "Relax, we just started," Edward chuckled. Sarah took a moment to calm herself, trying not to lash out. They had agreed in the morning that he would pick her up after work, but his state suggested he'd forgotten. "Can you take a taxi and pick up the order? Today's the last day, and the pickup point is closing soon." "I'm still at work," she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. A friend called out to Edward in the background. "Listen, Sarah, I can't. You'll have to manage on your own. On with the guys. See you at home," he said hurriedly and hung up. Sarah stared at the blank screen, gripping the phone tighter. What was the point of having a husband if she had to solve everything alone? What use was a husband who ditched her for fun with friends, even when they'd planned to spend the evening together? Months passed since that incident. Edward had long forgotten it. Sarah had been more distant, but he didn't see it as a problem. One day, he came home later than usual, only to find Sarah still not home. She hadn't warned him she'd be late. After a while, he grew worried and called her, but she didn't answer. He checked her location on the app she'd given him access to for emergencies. To his surprise, her location was off. Sarah returned home a couple of hours later. Edward, anxious and annoyed, confronted her in the hallway. "Sarah, where were you? What happened?" he demanded, a mix of worry and anger in his voice. She looked at him with a blank expression and replied indifferently, "Finishing a project." Edward wasn't satisfied. He wanted to know why she couldn't at least call. "Did you turn off your location? What's that about?" he asked, trying to contain his anger. "I'm not so worried about my safety anymore. I'm used to handling things on my own," she replied curtly. "So that feature is gone. Forget it." Edward realized then that she was still hurt from when he hadn't helped her. Sarah had always been sensitive. He remembered a time early in their relationship when she was upset by a message and ignored him for days while he was away. It wasn't until he came back and visited her that she forgave him. This time, the resentment lingered. Edward decided he needed to make it up to her. From that day on, he tried to be home on time and didn't touch alcohol for a week. He brought her favorite flowers, which she barely acknowledged, and when he invited her to a cafe, she claimed to be too busy with a difficult project at work. One evening, Edward figured Sarah would be tied up at work again, so he took his time heading home. He planned to meet up with his old buddy at their go-to pub nearby. A couple of drinks and then a leisurely walk home seemed like a perfect plan. The weather was just right. Ethan, his friend, kicked off the conversation by diving into his recent divorce. The split was fresh and the pain was raw. "Yeah, they're all the same, Ed," Ethan began. "The minute they spot a better prospect, they're out the door. No matter how hard you try to patch things up, it's a lost cause, believe me." Edward attempted to lift his friend's spirits, but his efforts fell flat. Lost in unpleasant thoughts, he eventually headed home. As he walked past a neighboring house, he noticed a fancy foreign car parked near the playground. A woman in a painfully familiar coat stepped out. Without a doubt, it was his Sarah. Edward called out to his wife and hurried towards her. Startled by the sudden noise, she clutched her heart, and the car sped off. "Who are you with? Tell me," he demanded, his temper rising. Sarah met his gaze without blinking. "It's a taxi, dear. You scared me," she replied coolly, then made her way to the entrance. Anger bubbled up in Edward. His gut told him she was lying. A few days later, Edward decided to check on his wife at her office in the late afternoon. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his mind had been restless. He hadn't slept well. Standing in the building's parking lot, lost in dark thoughts, he heard the familiar click of heels. He looked up and saw his wife walking with a man in a business suit. "Isn't that her boss?" he thought. They got into a car. Edward recognized it. It was the same foreign car he'd seen near their house. He slumped over the steering wheel. He didn't need any more proof. Everything was crystal clear. The boss's car started to move, but Edward remained rooted to the spot. What was the point of following them, watching them spend time together? It would only hurt him more. He went home, a bottle of strong drink in hand. He began packing his wife's belongings. When she returned, all her things were waiting for her in the hallway. She didn't immediately grasp what had happened, and without even taking off her shoes, went into the apartment looking for her husband. He was at the table, downing shots one after another. She was about to make a snide comment about his drinking, but he cut her off with a loud insult. "Yeah, look at him, drowning in booze," she started. "Watch your mouth, especially when you're the one hopping into the boss's car," he shouted back. Sarah quickly realized why her husband was so drunk and why there was a mountain of her things in the hallway. She didn't pretend to misunderstand his words. Instead, she boldly stated that it was his fault that she had found someone else. After all, unlike Edward, Finn had self-control, had no bad habits, and paid more attention to her than her own husband. Edward couldn't stand such brazen comparisons anymore. He ordered his unfaithful wife to leave his apartment immediately. Otherwise, he would not be responsible for what he could have done. Sarah looked at him in fright. She wanted to remind him that the apartment was shared, but she bit her tongue. Edward looked genuinely aggressive. Hastily, she gathered all the bags and left. The couple divorced, and Sarah moved in with her boss. Naturally, she had to resign from her previous job to avoid unnecessary gossip among her colleagues, but she didn't mind. She decided to take a break from everything for a while, and Finn gave her that opportunity. They got married a couple of years later. Edward heard that Sarah was happy in her new marriage, but he also heard from acquaintances that Finn continued to have affairs with his subordinates. Apparently, it was his weakness. Sarah either didn't notice or chose not to see the infidelity. It must have been hard for her to admit that she was now in the same position as those who were cheated on.